I would like to initially ask you about Cyprus's score. Cyprus has scored 55 in 2025, going down 1 point and down 11 points since 2012. How should we interpret this long-term decline? Is this stagnation, backsliding, or is it structural weakness?
No, thank you very much for the question. So as you said, Cyprus has decreased by 1 point since last year, so to 55. And then it's a significant decliner by 11 points on the Corruption Perceptions Index, which means that essentially more than one source agrees that there is an issue in regards to perceptions of political corruption within the country. I would say this is a combination of several different factors. So first, despite there being some reform efforts over the last few years in Cyprus, so for example, there's been some reform on lobbying transparency, the introduction of an anti-corruption agency, whistleblowing laws, etc. There's still a long way to go in terms of those being properly implemented and enforced. So I'd take that agency as an example. Still, I think there's concerns, obviously, of the independence of the agency and concerns that the appointments within the agency are politically appointed, that they're properly resourced to actually investigate political corruption and take that through to prosecution rates, which is also something that the European Commission has also highlighted. But then I would also say that Cyprus's score has been, it's 18th in the European Union. It has declined significantly over the last 10 years. And in many ways, I think it's far behind many other European countries in terms of having a strong overarching anti-corruption framework. So what I mean by that is also that there is an independent anti-corruption authority, but that also that there's a strong judicial independence within the country. And then also by the fact that there's many legislations that they've brought through, but this is going to have an impact on the score on years to come. So, for example, by the fact that there is countries in Europe that have had for a number of years now an anti-corruption strategy that they've fully enforced with an agency over a number of years, and Cyprus has only recently done that. So there are some areas that I think are positive to look at for Cyprus, but in many ways, unfortunately, I think there's a long way to go in terms of really targeting the corruption risk that exists within the country.
Yeah, and I would like to go into detail in some of the areas that you've highlighted. But scoring below the average of 64, I mean, as it is ranking in 18th. And then you briefly mentioned, but I'd like to talk about its governance model compared to peer member states. And maybe it's best to compare Cyprus to other smaller member states in the EU. Because, I mean, looking from a broad perspective, the Corruption Perception Index have been showing backslide even in traditionally strong democracies like France, Sweden, Netherlands. What is happening structurally across the EU, and how can we compare Cyprus with other smaller member states in this positioning?
I mean, in terms of other small member states, you have examples where you have like Malta, who are also very low on the index, for example, and they would say they've faced some similar challenges in regarding to Cyprus. So, for example, the impact on golden visas, the fact that this was basically a loophole for dirty money to enter the country and the country's financial sector and the economy. Also, in terms of the use of real estate for money laundering, the fact that prosecution of corruption is so low, and the fact that there hasn't been a fully resourced agency in either of the countries, prior to the fact that Cyprus have tried to introduce one are elements that are particularly concerning, as well as some other rule of law aspects and checks and balances that I would not say are as strong as others. But then there are also smaller EU countries where you take a country like Latvia or Estonia, who were previously much lower 10 years ago, but because of a dedicated campaign over the last few years by the government, where they've really focused on, I would say, an open transparency data approach to their anti-corruption reforms. They've particularly, say, in a country like Lithuania, they've introduced a very strong anti-corruption agency where, you know, a resourced efforts in terms of investigation and prosecution against corruption have improved. In Estonia, they have one of the best lobbying transparency rules within the union, where and also in terms of political finance transparency, where even as low as €1 of a donation to a political party is then published in an open data format for the public, for journalists to be able to see, which in terms of, if you compare to Cyprus, where I would say particularly the latest scandal, the video scandal that rocked the country, that was an example where if stronger political finance transparency measures had been in place, there would have been, you know, a more real-time reaction by the government to have open data to say who was funding the president or any political party, rather than what you have is a scandal which is in relation to concerns around campaign finance breaches, influence peddling, basically breaching what should have been a 1 million legal spending cap, whereas other countries have those measures in place in Europe, where you can, for example, see in real time who is donating who. It's an issue across the union. It's not just Cyprus, but there are countries that have brought those measures in, and some of them are small EU member states too.
Yes, I mean, especially I think you're referring to the digitalization reform Estonia has done, has
Yes,
directly
exactly. Yeah.
skyrocketed that. And I'd like to talk about the report that highlights concerns over operational framework, and as you have mentioned, the independence of the recently established Authority Against Corruption. And that is, to provide some context, making lobbying register fully open to the public and addressing weaknesses in the investigation and prosecution of the corruption cases. What does real independence actually require in practice for Cyprus? How can that facilitate? How can that take place?
I mean, I think the main thing there, as I mentioned already, is in regards to those that are in a board of or any agency, even an anti-corruption authority, but any agency or authority in a country need to be independently appointed. So if they're investigating a corruption case, that there's no influence by the government or by any outside actor. That really would also mean, you know, greater independence in investigation and prosecution of corruption. It's something that as Transparency International that we recommend in any investigation of a case. So that really, I think, is the missing factor that is crucial. And then obviously, when it comes to the wider rule of law structure within the country, the fact that the judiciary is also independently appointed. So when you have then the judges that are investigating and then taking this, you know, to court, etc., as a judge and reviewing the case, that they again are free to use the measures that are of the legal structure within the country, rather than being either pressured or even threatened. And we're seeing across Europe in many cases at the moment, unfortunately, even in France, for example, with the recent Sarkozy case last year, the former prime minister being investigated, that then the judges that were involved in that case were then threatened by members of the media or other political parties, which is really concerning, because what should be a standard within Europe and also the values of the EU that they promote, and why the European Commission has a very strong rule of law mechanism that they're trying to launch and give recommendations to member states, is that judges that within the judiciary are not threatened and can independently review and then prosecute relevant cases or whatever the result decides, of course.
Yes, and the weakest area seems to be the finance transparency on all of this. And you've already mentioned that one of the non-negotiables is going to be the independent appointment of people in position. But should campaign finance be also monitored by an independent body?
Yes, so what we would recommend as TI is that any such body, depending on the country itself, would be able to access and investigate disclosed data in terms of political finance. They'd be able to then, if there was a breach of a campaign finance cap, for example, in the Cyprus, this is the case recently, that they would have the resources to then investigate that and then enforce relevant sanctions, etc. And then by the fact of having that data available, they'd also be able to detect trends of undue influence on decision making within Cyprus or any country that we're talking about here, for example, and actually be able to scrutinize more closely where the money is coming from and to whom. And that should essentially be done by an independent authority to be able to ensure that there's independent oversight essentially on who's funding decision making within the country.
Yes. With the stress of the investigation and the prosecution to be very transparent and independent, I'd like to now talk about, as Cyprus is preparing to transpose the EU Anti-Corruption Directive within the next 3 years. The directive requires strategy development in consultation with the civil society.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a bit more about how meaningful does that need to be in terms of the performance of countries, especially Cyprus, in the corruption index?
So for further context, so the EU Anti-Corruption Directive has not been adopted yet. So it was agreed in December and it will be adopted very likely this month and in the coming weeks within the plenary of the European Parliament. And what that directive does is that it's going to create an overarching standard and harmonized rules on corruption within the Union, within the European Union, based on also a UN Convention Against Corruption, so implementing that at member state level. We as TI were disappointed by the ambition of the directive, but it does create an opportunity over the next 2 years. EU member states will have to transpose this directive into their national law. And there are a number of measures, including the fact that they will have to launch this anti-corruption strategy in the next 3 years in consultation with civil society. In terms of our recommendation for that, I mean, we would strongly advise in that regard that civil society are properly consulted in the creation of that strategy, but then also in terms of actually monitoring the implementation. And something we actually recommended in the directive itself was that not only that member states view civil society as a means of just engaging in activities around anti-corruption, but they're actually supported to have a safe enabling environment to hold governments accountable. So that, for example, if they are sharing recommendations or actually monitoring the actions of government, also the decision-making of government in regards to, for example, lobbying transparency or who's funding political parties, that they are not threatened, that their standing as organizations are not threatened, that they can operate freely, as well as also media and journalists being able to operate without concerns of legal lawsuits, etc., which unfortunately we're seeing across Europe, that those actors can then engage in the strategy being implemented and also then actively monitor how the strategy is being implemented in the years to come. So that's something that we would strongly advise. And it's no accident that the Corruption Perceptions Index, where it's low in Europe, also connects to where countries are also low in other indices where it comes to media freedom, civic space, democratic indices, for example, like international ideas or others. The stronger a country has of a civil society that they can operate freely, the more ability they have to then hold governments accountable, which is also a preventive mechanism against corruption, right? That those organizations and journalists are so important as an actor in terms of investigating corruption, actually working with governments to highlight certain cases of investigation. So that's also really crucial that the EU member states value that and also introduce that in their strategy as well, that there is a recognition of the role that civil society play in combating corruption.
Yes, and in line with that, monitoring and holding mechanisms to hold physicians accountable. I'd also like to talk about what the report refers, the failure to ensure a clear separation between business and government. So how does corruption even start? Is this the state capture, the form of corruption where private interest influence states, institutions, and policies? The state culture, how does it manifest itself? Is it a smaller state problem, or if you're looking at Cyprus, how does this problem begin? Because there's the problem to begin with, and then how to overcome, how to monitor, how to prevent that. But let's talk about how it starts as well.
So, I mean, the Corruption Perceptions Index is a composite methodology where it's also collected by a number of sources which look at how experts and business people in countries perceive corruption. And this is numerous sources like the World Economic Forum, but also the World Bank. And a number of those indexes look at the close relationship between business and the public sector. And it's not just an issue within Cyprus, but also I would say across numerous European countries, that the regulations to combat under influence of the private sector in public decision making, because what we would advocate for as TI is that there's nothing wrong with lobbying. It's it's part of how public decisions can collect what we would argue equal access to in regards to influencing how a government brings in a new legislation or policy, for example. But when you have the issue in Europe where this is so heavily influenced by big corporations, big business, also the risk increasingly of maybe foreign influence from outside governments, and then countries have no way of actually monitoring that effectively or regulating against it. So, for example, a big issue in many European countries is still the issue of revolving doors, where those working in the public sector would then go and work for the private sector in a very short amount of time and then have the access to be able to influence and use those contacts for their own interest. Or, for example, that they perhaps have a conflict of interest where they perhaps are on a board of a company or investments in a company, and then actually are overseeing a regulation or a policy that has a direct conflict of interest with that company. And there's numerous examples of this. I mean, the biggest one at the moment is in regards to the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, who was re-elected last year, who has a huge conflict of interest in one of the biggest agricultural businesses and chemical businesses in Europe. Or other examples could be, for example, at the Brussels level, there's numerous MEPs, for example, that are involved in regulations that then they have perhaps conflicts of interest where they're involved in companies that would have direct impact on, for example, in the environment sector or the agricultural sector. So it is a huge issue, I would say, across countries, and there's a suite of measures that we recommend in terms of what we would call like a political integrity toolbox in many ways, that, for example, enhancing regulation on conflicts of interest, lobbying transparency, also on revolving doors, that essentially gives a country a better framework to be able to monitor who's influencing what and ensuring there is an equal playing ground, that it isn't just money that is informing our decision making at country level.
And in light of that, which reforms have urgency to be prioritized by immediate effect? Political finance, whistleblower protection, asset declaration, judicial capacity. Where do we need reforms urgently? Which ones, or are we to draw examples from the other EU member states, as you mentioned, Estonia, for example?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a number of things I would recommend. So first is the independence of the Anti-Corruption Authority being properly rolled out and resourced. The fact that the lobbying register at the moment is still not properly accessible and functional.
Partially transparent, to argue.
Yeah,
we do have a lobbying register, but
yeah,
it should be fully open to the public,
yeah,
the report suggests.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then the other area, which I think the most recent scandal in Cyprus indicates, and this is really something that we're calling on across Europe, because at the moment nearly 3/4 of political donations in the EU are hidden from public view, which is a really shocking statistic in regards to essentially opaque influence across European democracies. And that's also evident really in the scandal in Cyprus, in the sense that if there'd been proper real-time reporting on of where the funding is coming from for the presidential campaign or political parties, then there'd be much more of a framework to be able to regulate political party donations, that it's also available to the public, like in some EU member countries already, like I've referenced. And that would also protect, if this is the argument that the Cypriot government are saying in terms of foreign undue influence, those measures are also a strong way of protecting Cypriot democracy from foreign undue influence. So I would say that's also an area that it's not just Cyprus that needs to combat this, but the whole of the European Union, that if we want to protect European democracies, that political finance transparency is one of the biggest issues currently on the agenda.
And I'd like to talk about the societal tension that we see now, the decline on the corruption index, and the public does feel a distrust. And I'd like to tie that to, where does this lead over the next decade? I mean, given that the actions are made and the reforms are done on new laws, prosecution, transparency, what would be key to restore trust in citizens and in people?
I mean, I think citizens care most about what's going to impact their everyday lives, right? So the more the measures that I've mentioned are in place, the better understanding we get on why public decisions are made, for example, how the government is also spending money. So we haven't really talked about, for example, kind of public procurement reform, but that's also an area that is something that is also a weakness across the European Union. And ultimately, the more that you have those frameworks in place to be able to evidence how money is being spent, who is informing it, etc., those preventive measures can also save the government money, for example. So for the fact that you're not losing money to fraud schemes or through other corruption mechanisms, or the fact that maybe money is going into the pockets of those in power, etc., or through whatever means, that, and that money can then also go into public service delivery, for example, that it can improve health systems or education systems, and that can take years in the making of evidencing that, right? But I think a first step is that citizens know, that the elected officials that they go to the ballot box to vote for, kind of who's informing their decision making, and then what impact that's having, for example. And that's firstly a step to restoring trust. And then the next stage is, of course, then the fact that ultimately that, what, again, another shocking statistic in Europe at the moment is that there's a reported even from 200 billion to 900 billion per year is lost to corruption in the European Union's economy. So imagine that amount of money that could be actually used effectively in terms of ensuring that the economies or cost of living crisis can be more effectively combated within Cyprus, but also across the European Union. I mean, real estate prices, for example, I think that is one of the biggest examples of that a lot of people in Europe at the moment are concerned about. the cost of rent or the cost to buy property. If you had a system in place where it's an equal playing ground and real estate's not being purchased to launder money by those either in country or outside it, then it's more likely to have an impact on the everyday life of a citizen, and ultimately would restore trust as well.
Thank you very much for your time and your answer to these questions.